Think of the Lineweaver-Burk plot as the detective tool for biochemists. Instead of staring at a curvy, confusing Michaelis-Menten graph, we transform it into a straight line. This plot reveals secrets about enzyme behavior, from how fast they work to how they respond to inhibitors. So grab your detective hats because we're about to solve the case of enzyme inhibition. Understanding the axes, what's the deal with y and x? In the Lineweaver-Burk plot, the y-axis is 1 over v, representing the inverse of the reaction velocity. The closer the line is to 0 on the y-axis, the higher the Vmax, maximum reaction rate. The x-axis is 1 over substrate concentration, representing the inverse of substrate concentration. The closer the line is to 0 on the x-axis, the higher the Km, Michaelis constant, or affinity measure. Let's look at how these axes help us interpret enzyme behavior and introduce real-life applications to tie it all together. Point 1, the closer to 0 on the y-axis, the higher the Vmax. In a Lineweaver-Burk plot, Vmax, maximum speed of an enzyme reaction, is inversely related to the y-intercept. When Vmax is higher, the y-intercept is closer to 0, reflecting a fast, efficient enzyme. Clinical case. Consider lactase enzyme deficiency. Lactase is the enzyme responsible for breaking down lactose in milk. In people who are lactose intolerant, there's less lactase, meaning a low Vmax. This lower Vmax is reflected by a higher y-intercept, showing the enzyme can't process lactose efficiently. When lactose-intolerant people take lactase supplements, the extra enzyme increases the Vmax, bringing the y-intercept lower on the Lineweaver-Burk plot. This is why they can enjoy a milkshake without worrying about stomach cramps. Fun analogy. Imagine Vmax as the number of lanes on a highway during rush hour. The more lanes you have, higher Vmax, the faster everyone can get through. But if you're lactose intolerant, it's like having only one lane, everything backs up and you get symptoms. Lactase supplements open up more lanes. Point 2, the closer to 0 on the x-axis, the higher the Km. Km reflects the enzyme's affinity for its substrate. In a Lineweaver-Burk plot, a higher Km means the x-intercept is closer to the origin. High Km implies a lower affinity, so the enzyme needs more substrate to get working efficiently. Clinical case. Consider alcohol dehydrogenase, ADH, an enzyme that breaks down alcohol in the liver. People with a high Km version of ADH have a lower affinity for alcohol. They need more alcohol, substrate, to reach half of Vmax, which means they tolerate alcohol better. Conversely, people with a low Km version of ADH have a high affinity for alcohol, so they metabolize it quickly and may experience hangover symptoms more acutely. Fun twist, Km is like a coffee lover's tolerance. High Km, low affinity, is like someone who needs a whole pot of coffee before they feel energized. Low Km, high affinity, is like someone who gets jittery after one cup. If your ADH enzyme has a high Km, it's like having a high coffee tolerance. You can handle more before feeling tipsy. Point 3, the higher the Km, the lower the affinity. Km represents how strongly the enzyme holds on to its substrate. Higher Km means lower affinity, as it takes more substrate to reach half of Vmax. Clinical case. Let's talk about hexokinase versus glucokinase and glucose metabolism. Hexokinase has a low Km, meaning high affinity. It works even when glucose levels are low. This is important in tissues like the brain that always need energy. Glucokinase, on the other hand, has a higher Km and works mainly in the liver. It activates only when glucose levels are high, like after a big meal. Analogy? Think of hexokinase as a friend who's always available for coffee, while glucokinase is the friend who's only available on weekends. Hexokinase's high affinity, low Km, makes it reliable at any time, while glucokinase's lower affinity, high Km, means it shows up only when there's plenty of glucose around. Point 4. Competitive inhibitors cross each other, whereas non-competitive inhibitors do not. Inhibitors can be thought of as speed bumps or roadblocks for enzymes. How these inhibitors affect enzyme activity is what makes Lineweaver-Burk plots so useful. Competitive inhibitors compete with the substrate for the active site. On a Lineweaver-Burk plot, competitive inhibition causes the lines to intersect at the same y-intercept. The reason? Competitive inhibitors increase Km, making the enzyme less effective at low substrate concentrations, but do not affect Vmax, since more substrate can outcompete the inhibitor. Clinical case. A great example is statins, which are competitive inhibitors of HMG-CoA reductase, an enzyme involved in cholesterol production. By competing with the enzyme's natural substrate, statins lower cholesterol synthesis in the liver. The Lineweaver-Burk plot for a statin shows lines intersecting at the y-intercept, reflecting an increase in Km, requiring more substrate to reach half-max speed without affecting the overall Vmax. Fun analogy. Imagine two cars racing to grab a parking spot. The substrate and competitive inhibitor are both vying for the same spot, enzyme active site. Competitive inhibitors increase Km because they're hogging spaces, making the substrate work harder, need more concentration to get in. Non-competitive inhibitors. Non-competitive inhibitors, on the other hand, bind to a different site on the enzyme. They don't prevent the substrate from binding, but they reduce the enzyme's overall functionality. In a Lineweaver-Burk plot, non-competitive inhibitors result in parallel lines with different y-intercepts. This is because they lower Vmax, the enzyme's top speed, without affecting Km. Clinical case. Allopurinol, used in treating gout, is a non-competitive inhibitor of xanthine oxidase, an enzyme that produces uric acid. By inhibiting this enzyme, allopurinol lowers uric acid production, reducing gout symptoms. The Lineweaver-Burk plot for allopurinol shows parallel lines, indicating a decrease in Vmax without changing Km. Fun twist: think of non-competitive inhibitors like a construction zone that reduces highway speed. No matter how many cars, substrate enter, the speed limit, Vmax, is reduced due to the construction zone non-competitive inhibitor, so Km doesn't change. Point 5. Competitive inhibitors increase Km. Since competitive inhibitors block the active site, they make it harder for the substrate to bind, effectively increasing Km. This shift indicates that more substrate is required to reach half of Vmax. Clinical case. Methotrexate is a competitive inhibitor of dihydrofolate reductase, an enzyme involved in DNA synthesis. By raising Km, methotrexate slows down DNA replication, which is beneficial in treating cancer by targeting rapidly dividing cells. The Lineweaver-Burk plot for methotrexate shows increased Km, closer x-intercept, reflecting this competitive inhibition. Fun analogy. Imagine competitive inhibitors like pop-up ads when you're trying to click a button. They don't change the button's function but make it harder to access, requiring more effort or substrate to reach your goal. Summary: Lineweaver-Burk in a nutshell. So to wrap things up, Vmax relates to the y-axis. The closer the y-intercept is to 0, the higher the enzyme's top speed. Km relates to the x-axis. The closer the x-intercept is to 0, the higher the Km and the lower the affinity. Competitive inhibitors increase Km and intersect on the y-axis without affecting Vmax. Non-competitive inhibitors decrease Vmax, are parallel, and leave Km unchanged. The Lineweaver-Burk plot is like a map that guides us through enzyme behavior, helping us tailor therapies and understand how inhibitors influence our body's molecular machinery. Thanks for joining me on this detective journey through enzyme kinetics.